The autumn air hung heavy over tea. For her, murder wasn't revenge. It was joy. Welcome to Warm Leaves. I am your host, Raven. Tell me where you're tuning in from. Your words keep these mysteries alive. Now let's unravel her dark desire. The quiet village of St. Mary Mead, a damp mist curling along the cobblestones like a creature reluctant to retreat. At number 12, Primrose Lane, a house of modest charm and perfectly tended rose bushes, the serenity of the village shattered with the discovery of a body. Mr. Jonathan Price, a retired solicitor of respectable standing, was found dead in his study. Alone, the door locked from the inside, a single window bolted tight. His servant, a pale and trembling young man named Thomas, discovered him in the early hours of the morning after he failed to respond to repeated knocks. The constable who arrived first, young Inspector Palmer, was baffled. The death appeared almost too tidy. Price sat slumped over his desk, a faint expression of surprise frozen on his features. No blood, no sign of a struggle. The only irregularity was a single, crisp playing card resting by his hand. The Queen of Hearts. No deck was found anywhere in the house. The room itself was immaculate, every book aligned neatly on the shelves, papers stacked precisely, and a faint scent of lilac lingering in the air. Palmer had locked and unlocked the door himself to be certain, but there was no doubt. Someone had left the study entirely sealed from within. A physician determined that Mr. Price had died from poisoning, though precisely how it had been administered was unclear. There was no food, drink, or sign of any substance in the room that could have killed him. News traveled quickly in St. Mary Mead. A locked room death in the middle of their peaceful village was exactly the sort of thing that could not remain contained to whispers. Miss Jane Marple, of course, heard about it before the day was over. She was sipping tea at her parlor window when young Palmer stopped by, hat in hand, his brow furrowed in helpless confusion. "It's the card, you see," he said, frustration prickling his voice. "What in blazes does it mean? Queen of Hearts, romantic nonsense, or a threat?" Miss Marple listened carefully, her pale blue eyes calm. "Murderers, my dear Inspector," she said gently, "do not leave playing cards out of sentiment. They leave them either to mislead or to remind." Her words followed him back to the scene. Price had not been particularly well liked, though neither had he been openly despised. A widower these last 10 years, he lived alone with no close relatives except for a distant nephew in London. Yet in recent months, whispers had circulated that he was keeping company with Mrs. Agnes Whitcomb, a wealthy widow known for her charm and social connections. That fact in itself was hardly scandalous, but there were murmurs of late-night visits, unusual withdrawals from his bank account, and a quarrel, overheard at the post office only last week. Miss Marple, unobtrusive as ever, paid a polite call to Mrs. Whitcomb under the guise of delivering a basket of quinces. Agnes answered the door in black silk, her voice honeyed, her smile just tight enough to suggest discomfort. She claimed to be dreadfully shocked by the news and assured Miss Marple she had only seen Jonathan briefly the week before. But Marple's sharp gaze caught something, the faintest trace of lilac perfume in the hallway, identical to the scent that had clung to Price's study. The village gossip thickened like fog. Mrs. Whitcomb, it seemed, had enjoyed the company of several gentlemen over the years, each of them suddenly ending their attentions under mysterious or abrupt circumstances. A Colonel Smythe had died unexpectedly on a trip abroad. A Mr. Latham had broken off an engagement without explanation. Each story was harmless enough on its own, but together they formed a subtle pattern. One Miss Marple tucked away like a stitch in her knitting. Inspector Palmer, meanwhile, exhausted the obvious avenues. The servant Thomas was questioned repeatedly, but the boy's alibi was watertight. He had been at the village pub at the time of death, in plain view of half the regular patrons. No one had been seen entering or leaving the house. The windows were secure, the door locked, and the key was found inside, lying neatly on the desk. It was then Miss Marple requested a look at the study herself. With her usual quiet determination, she examined every corner, her fingers trailing lightly along the desk. She noted the dustless space where a decanter usually stood, the faint crease in the carpet near the window, and the unusual positioning of the chair, turned slightly away from the desk, as though Price had been interrupted mid-thought. Her eyes fell once more on the Queen of Hearts. She did not touch it, merely smiled faintly and murmured, "Curious, very curious." That evening she took a quiet walk, her path leading her, by sheer coincidence, of course, past Mrs. Whitcomb's home. The widow was entertaining a visitor, a handsome man in a grey suit who slipped away quickly upon noticing Miss Marple. The next morning, rumours spread that Agnes had been planning a trip to Brighton, though no one could recall her mentioning it before. Miss Marple now had her pieces in place. The locked room was no mystery at all, if one considered not how someone might have entered after the door was locked, but how the victim might have died before it was locked at all. Poison, discreet and slow-acting, would explain the absence of any visible cause. A visit earlier in the evening, a drink laced with something subtle, and Price would have gone about his evening unsuspecting until the effects took hold. As for the door, locked rooms are only impossible when one assumes the victim could not have done the locking himself before collapsing. The Queen of Hearts, however, was another matter. Here was no random flourish. It was a calling card of sorts, one Miss Marple suspected had nothing to do with romance at all. The Queen of Hearts, in certain circles, had been Mrs. Whitcomb's nickname, an old jest among her admirers, owing to her tendency to collect gentlemen as easily as others collected playing cards. A private joke, perhaps, but one known to a few in the village. By the second evening, Palmer returned to Miss Marple, exasperated. "It makes no sense," he said. "No signs, no motive we can prove. And that widow, charming as a songbird, but she's far too calm." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Calmness, my dear Inspector, is a mask easily worn by those who believe themselves cleverer than everyone else. You must remember that pride is often the undoing of such people." Her plan was simple. A polite tea at the vicarage, an invitation extended to Mrs. Whitcomb, and the casual mention, oh so delicately, that Jonathan Price's solicitor in London had been in touch, hinting at a letter Price had posted the very day before his death. A letter, they said, addressed to a certain individual with knowledge of recent affairs. Mrs. Whitcomb's teacup rattled only slightly, but for Miss Marple it was all the proof she required. Within a day, Mrs. Whitcomb's planned trip was abruptly cancelled. Inspector Palmer, at Miss Marple's gentle prompting, obtained a warrant for a search of her home. Among her possessions, tucked away in a locked drawer, was a deck of playing cards, missing the Queen of Hearts. By the time Agnes Whitcomb was taken into custody, she had composed herself admirably. She claimed it was all a misunderstanding, the card a harmless memento, the death of Jonathan Price a tragic coincidence. But Miss Marple, who had long since learned the subtleties of human nature, knew better. "The trouble with clever murderers," she remarked quietly as the constable led the widow away, "is that they always think they're playing a game of cards. But life, dear Inspector, is rather more like knitting. One loose stitch and the whole pattern unravels." Inspector Palmer had the manner of a man determined to look busy, though Miss Marple could see, in the slight stiffness of his shoulders, that he was entirely out of his depth. The arrest of Mrs. Whitcomb had been more a matter of removing an inconvenience than of closing a case. There was no confession, no signed statement, nothing to tie her absolutely to Jonathan Price's death beyond a card, a bottle of lilac perfume, and a very suggestive pattern of history. The trouble, of course, was that suggestive patterns, while useful to a sharp mind, tended to falter under the cold scrutiny of a magistrate. Miss Marple knew this well. She had seen many a neatly wrapped case fall apart for lack of one stubborn thread. So when Palmer invited her to accompany him for a second inspection of Price's home, under the guise, of course, of seeking a fresh perspective. She agreed without hesitation. She arrived at the house in her plain blue coat, her knitting tucked unobtrusively into her handbag. The study looked as it had before, though it had grown stale in the intervening days, the scent of lilac now faint, almost imperceptible. Palmer busied himself with his notebook while a constable examined the desk drawers again, muttering about how there's nothing here but papers. Miss Marple's gaze, however, drifted beyond the obvious. She noted the books, most in perfect order, spines facing neatly outward. But one, a slim volume of poetry, sat just slightly proud of the others, as if it had been pushed back hurriedly. She did not touch it, not yet, but filed the detail away. Her attention moved next to the decanter, now returned to its place by the constable. She saw at once that the stopper was mismatched, not an obvious difference, just enough that one might not notice unless one were very familiar with the set. The glass was ever so slightly cloudier, the cut pattern faintly different. She smiled inwardly. Little things in her experience were rarely so little. Palmer noticed her pause. "Something, Miss Marple." "Oh, nothing of consequence," she said mildly, her eyes soft behind her spectacles. "Only that gentlemen of tidy habits rarely misplace their own belongings. I should think Mr. Price was quite a creature of order." Palmer frowned at the decanter, uncertain what he was meant to see, and turned back to his notes. It was in the hallway, on their way out, that Miss Marple saw the next curious detail. A coat stand stood by the door, its pegs orderly save for one. A hook that held nothing, but showed a faint mark where something heavy had hung for some time. There was no raincoat or hat to account for it. It was the sort of absence most people would never notice, but in Miss Marple's mind, it loomed like an empty frame on a wall. Outside, the village went on with its ordinary rhythm. Mrs. Whitcomb's arrest had been the talk of every shop, and yet, curiously, not all tongues wagged in the same direction. Miss Hartnell, over at the grocer's, insisted she'd seen Mrs. Whitcomb at home the night of the murder, though her memory was uncertain as to the hour. Mr. Soames, the postmaster, swore she had posted a letter 2 days before Price's death, though he could not recall the recipient. These small uncertainties troubled Miss Marple, for the truth in her experience never shifted so much from mouth to mouth unless someone had a reason for it to do so. That evening, Palmer reported that Mrs. Whitcomb's visitor, the man in the grey suit, had been identified as a Mr. Gerald Lucas, a business associate from London. Lucas had left the village abruptly, offering no forwarding address. Palmer, ever diligent in the wrong direction, dismissed the matter as unrelated. "No proof he had anything to do with Price," he muttered. Miss Marple, on the other hand, thought about the Queen of Hearts again. A card, a gentleman caller, and a widow planning an abrupt trip. These things rarely drifted into coincidence in St. Mary Mead. The following day, she returned quietly to Price's study, this time alone, under the polite pretext of gathering some of his personal effects for the solicitor. She opened the volume of poetry that had sat uneven on the shelf. Inside, neatly tucked between the pages, was a folded letter. It bore no address, only a single line in Jonathan Price's neat hand. For the truth is a mirror, and even hearts must look into it. Miss Marple replaced the letter carefully, saying nothing to the constable outside. Instead, she walked home, slowly, her thoughts knitting together in the same quiet, deliberate way her hands worked yarn. At the vicarage later that evening, she listened without interruption as Mrs. Price's nephew, summoned from London at last, spoke of his uncle's affairs. There had been, he said, a recent withdrawal of several £100. Jonathan Price had mentioned an arrangement that was to be finalized in the coming days. The nephew did not know the nature of it, but his tone suggested it was something delicate, perhaps something that might embarrass the family. Miss Marple asked, very gently, whether his uncle had been in the habit of playing cards. The young man looked surprised. Good heavens, no. Uncle detested the things. Said they were a vulgar pastime. He hadn't so much as touched a deck in years. That night, Miss Marple stood by her window, watching the lamplight from Mrs. Whitcomb's home. The widow, outwardly calm, had ceased her visits to the shops. Gerald Lucas had vanished. The Queen of Hearts lay unanswered in the center of it all. And somewhere, tucked behind all the polite words and the tidy evidence, there was still a single misplaced truth, waiting to be pulled free. Inspector Palmer prided himself on efficiency, though Miss Marple suspected he mistook movement for progress. Over the next 2 days, he summoned the key figures for questioning at the station, each producing neat statements that, like lace, seemed perfectly formed, until one examined the tiny gaps in the stitching. Mrs. Whitcomb was the first to arrive. She entered in her well-pressed mourning attire, a veil just dramatic enough to suggest grief without obscuring her expression. Her voice trembled in precisely the right places as she described her dear friendship with Jonathan Price. She claimed she had not seen him the evening of his death, having stayed home alone reading until late. Palmer asked about the Queen of Hearts. She laughed lightly, almost indulgently, at the suggestion of meaning. "Oh, Inspector, must every symbol point to me? It's a card, nothing more. Perhaps Jonathan played a game with friends, or perhaps someone wished to make it seem as though I had reason to harm him. I cannot be responsible for every coincidence that falls into place." Miss Marple, seated quietly in the corner, said nothing. She noted, however, the faintest pause before Mrs. Whitcomb answered the question, just enough to suggest calculation, not surprise. Next came Thomas, the servant. Nervous as a rabbit, he wrung his cap in his hands and spoke in hurried bursts. His story was much the same as before. He had gone to the public house after dinner, returning in the early morning to find Mr. Price unresponsive. But Palmer, perhaps emboldened by Miss Marple's silent presence, pressed a little harder. Had Thomas seen anyone near the house that night? Thomas hesitated, eyes darting to the inspector, then to Miss Marple, then down to his cap. "Well, there was someone," he muttered at last. "Not close to the house, mind you. Just across the lane. I saw a man in a grey suit standing by the hedge. Didn't think much of it at the time. Thought he might be a stranger passing through, but now I suppose—" Palmer's pen stilled. "You didn't mention this before?" Thomas flushed. "Didn't seem important, sir. And, well, I thought you might think I was making things up." Miss Marple's eyes brightened slightly behind her spectacles. Gerald Lucas again. His shadow stretched a little longer. The postmaster, Mr. Soames, was next. He arrived with a stack of envelopes under his arm, eager to be useful. He repeated that Mrs. Whitcomb had sent a letter 2 days before Price's death, addressed to London. He could not recall the addressee, but insisted the handwriting was hers. Miss Marple, without interrupting, asked whether Jonathan Price had sent any letters of his own that week. Mr. Soames furrowed his brow, thinking hard. "Now you mention it, Miss Marple. There was one. Thick paper, fine envelope, addressed to a solicitor in town, posted the day before he died. Came in personally to drop it off. Said it was a matter of urgency." Miss Marple exchanged the faintest glance with Palmer, who failed to notice the subtle satisfaction in her expression. She now had 2 letters unaccounted for, each likely holding a fragment of truth neither sender wished made public. Mrs. Hartnell was questioned next, summoned from her shopping just long enough to confirm she had indeed seen Mrs. Whitcomb the evening of Price's death, though her account shifted as she spoke. First she claimed it was around dusk, then perhaps a bit later, until finally she admitted she could not be certain at all. "But she was at home when I called by," Hartnell insisted. "She answered the door herself, so she couldn't have been running about doing mischief." Miss Marple gave a small smile. "And did she seem surprised to see you?" Mrs. Hartnell blinked. "Well, She took a moment before opening the door, but widows must be allowed a little untidiness in their own homes, mustn't they? The interviews ended with an unexpected visitor, Mr. Gerald Lucas himself. His sudden reappearance was explained away as a matter of misunderstood travel plans, but his timing made even Palmer's brows knit together in suspicion. Lucas was polished, confident, and far too eager to distance himself from Mrs. Whitcomb. He claimed his business with her was strictly professional, concerning a potential investment she was considering. Palmer asked if he had ever met Jonathan Price. Lucas's answer came too smoothly. Only in passing, a greeting here or there. We moved in different circles. Miss Marple, still silent, observed the faintest flicker of discomfort when she mentioned the Queen of Hearts. Lucas smiled, but it was tight, the kind of smile one wears to conceal the fact that they've just remembered something unpleasant. When the questioning was over, Palmer sighed, closing his notebook with the air of a man who had gathered many words but little substance. They're all saying different things, Miss Marple. If anything, they've made it muddier than before. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly in her lap. But contradictions, Inspector, are rather like dropped stitches. They tell us not that the pattern is ruined, but that we must look closer to see where the thread went astray. You see, every one of them is telling the truth, as they wish it to be remembered. But the truth, I find, does not shift so easily, unless it is being guided. She thought again of the missing raincoat from the stand, the mismatched decanter stopper, the letter in the book of poetry. Voices could deceive, but objects were far less accommodating. Palmer looked at her uncertainly. And what do you think they're guiding us toward? Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her voice was calm. Away from the thing they most fear will be found, Inspector, and I suspect it is not merely the matter of a card or a quarrel. No, this is a game of concealment, and when one hides something so carefully, one often leaves behind the very clue that will reveal it. Inspector Palmer had a board now, an actual wooden board set up in the station, covered with names, times, and notes, scribbled hastily in his own hand. It gave the satisfying impression of progress, but to Miss Marple it looked more like a map of confusion than clarity. Everyone had a reason to be on it. Everyone had a reason to want Jonathan Price gone. Mrs. Whitcomb's motive was the one everyone whispered about, her finances. Rumor painted her as a widow whose funds had dwindled to the point where Jonathan Price's sudden death, with certain investments transferring hands, could be her salvation. But Miss Marple knew rumor was rarely a clean guide. It liked to embellish, to simplify. Mrs. Whitcomb's cool performance in the questioning, her refusal to panic, felt less like desperation and more like confidence. That, to Miss Marple, was more dangerous. Gerald Lucas's motives were murkier. His business dealings with Mrs. Whitcomb seemed a little too conveniently timed. Lucas had turned up in the village just as Price was making urgent arrangements with his solicitor, and then had left suddenly after Price's death. Miss Marple noted that Lucas had no visible means of support except charm and opportunity, traits that were useful in persuading a widow into a risky financial scheme. And if Price had stood in the way of that arrangement, well, Lucas's polished smile would not be the first she'd seen that hid a rather more desperate intent. Then there was Thomas, the servant, whose loyalty seemed genuine but whose circumstances were less secure. Miss Marple remembered how quickly he admitted to seeing Lucas by the hedge. Why admit that now and not before? Perhaps it was fear of being accused himself. Thomas's livelihood had depended on Price. With Price gone, his position was precarious. He might gain little from his master's death directly, but fear could drive people to strange alliances. Even Mr. Soames, the postmaster, had his curious place in the maze. Miss Marple found herself wondering why he had been so quick to bring up Mrs. Whitcomb's letter, but so vague about the one Price had sent to his solicitor. Price had trusted his correspondence to Soames personally, and yet there had been no follow-up from the solicitor. Had the letter reached its destination at all? A missing letter could conceal many inconvenient truths about finances, about partnerships, about enemies closer than anyone realized. And then there was Mrs. Hartnell. A well-meaning busybody, yes, but her alibi for Mrs. Whitcomb was inconsistent. Hartnell's fondness for gossip made her easy to manipulate. Had she been prompted to remember seeing the widow at home? Miss Marple suspected Mrs. Whitcomb was clever enough to make sure Hartnell saw just enough to keep her talking, but not enough to establish the truth. The trouble was, each motive could stand on its own, but none neatly explained everything. Mrs. Whitcomb might benefit financially, but what of the card? Lucas might have been involved in shady dealings, but why risk reappearing in the village if he'd had a hand in murder? Thomas might fear for his security, but how would he gain from Price's death? Each thread pulled against another, creating a tangle rather than a rope. Miss Marple sat quietly in her cottage one afternoon, tea cooling at her side as she laid out the puzzle in her mind. She thought of the card again. It was not a threat, she decided. It was a message. To whom, she was not yet certain. But the choice of the Queen of Hearts, placed on the desk beside a mismatched decanter stopper, spoke of something deliberate. Not a burst of passion, but a careful gesture. And gestures were made for audiences. Her mind returned to the missing raincoat. A coat could carry many things, a bottle, perhaps, or even a letter. Someone had left Price's house that night, prepared to take something with them, and yet, if they had been in a hurry, why pause to leave a playing card behind? No, the card had been placed intentionally, as part of a design meant to point suspicion in a particular direction. The next morning, Miss Marple went quietly to see Mr. Soames again. Over tea in the back room of the post office, she inquired about Price's solicitor. The reply was vague. No response to the letter, no word since the death. Strange, Soames admitted. Usually they're quick about these things. Miss Marple smiled faintly. And stranger still if the letter never arrived at all. From there, she paid a polite call on Mrs. Whitcomb. The widow was gracious, almost too gracious, but Miss Marple's eyes roamed the tidy sitting room. On a side table sat a crystal decanter, the twin to the one in Price's study. And here, the stopper matched perfectly. Mrs. Whitcomb noticed her gaze and, with a faint smile, poured a small glass of sherry for her guest. Miss Marple sipped politely, her mind cataloguing every detail. A matched stopper here, a mismatched one there, a man in a grey suit at the hedge, a missing raincoat, a letter that never reached its destination. Back at the vicarage that evening, she reviewed what she knew. Each suspect had a motive: money, protection, reputation. But none of them had acted alone. The pattern was too neat for a single pair of hands. She thought again of the phrase in the letter hidden in the book of poetry. For the truth is a mirror, and even hearts must look into it. A mirror. A reflection. Each suspect's story mirrored another's just enough to create confusion, yet the gaps between them, like the empty hook on the coat stand, revealed where the truth had been carefully removed. The motive maze was still tangled, but Miss Marple could feel the threads drawing tighter. It was no longer a question of whether someone had lied. It was a question of how many of them had lied together. Inspector Palmer was in high spirits the next morning, a mood that Miss Marple had learned to distrust. He met her at the station with a certain swagger, as though he had just placed the final piece into an especially stubborn puzzle. "We've got him, Miss Marple," he said, waving a folded document in his hand. "Gerald Lucas." Clear as day. Lucas, it appeared, had been discovered at the local inn attempting to settle his bill with a check drawn on an account belonging not to him, but to Jonathan Price. Confronted, he had offered a convoluted explanation about an investment arrangement that had been mutually beneficial. The bank records, however, showed Price had withdrawn a substantial sum shortly before his death. Combined with Lucas's sudden departure after the murder, Palmer considered it open and shut. By noon, Lucas was in custody. The local papers were already preparing triumphant headlines. Palmer walked through the village like a man basking in the glow of his own competence. But Miss Marple, knitting in her usual chair at the vicarage, felt the same small unease she always did when solutions arrived too neatly. That afternoon she visited the station, ostensibly to bring a small basket of scones. Lucas was in the holding cell, still exuding his polished charm, but with a new undercurrent of controlled indignation. When Miss Marple asked, in her mild way, if he had known about the Queen of Hearts, Lucas blinked in genuine confusion. "Queen of what?" "I don't play cards, Miss Marple, and I certainly don't leave them about crime scenes." It was the unfeigned bewilderment in his voice that caught her attention. Lucas was a man skilled at false confidence. If the card meant something to him, he would have spun an explanation. Instead, he reacted as though he had never heard of it. Afterward, she lingered in the outer office, watching Palmer's officers go about their work. The missing raincoat had been all but forgotten. The mismatched decanter stopper sat in an evidence bag on the shelf, ignored now that a culprit was behind bars. The authorities had seized upon the bank records like a lifeline, eager to declare the case closed. That evening, Miss Marple took a quiet walk past Jonathan Price's house. The lane was still damp from a recent rain, the hedges glistening. She paused by the spot where Thomas had seen Lucas on the night of the murder. In the soft earth by the hedge, she noticed something the rain had only just revealed. A small button, darkened and half-buried. It was not the sort of button one found on Lucas's tailored suits. It was plainer, heavier. More in keeping, she thought, with the sort of raincoat missing from Price's hall. The next day, she called on Mrs. Whitcomb. The widow was dressed in black again, but her eyes shone a little too brightly at the news of Lucas's arrest. "Well," she said smoothly, "justice does seem to have been served, doesn't it?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, indeed. Though one wonders why, if Mr. Lucas were guilty, he would have returned to the village at all. Men in flight do not often double back to the scene of the crime. Unless," she added gently, "they are meant to be seen there." Mrs. Whitcomb's expression cooled just for a moment before the gracious mask returned. Back at the vicarage, Miss Marple spread her notes across the table. The raincoat, the button, the card, the missing letter, the matched stopper at Mrs. Whitcomb's house. Lucas had likely been reckless, perhaps dishonest in money matters, but the careful staging of the crime scene was not his style. The gesture of the Queen of Hearts, the decanter stopper, these were touches of someone who wanted to control the narrative. Palmer, however, was preparing his final report. Lucas had motive, opportunity, and the financial link, he told her. The Crown will take it from here. Miss Marple nodded politely, but her mind was already elsewhere. The real criminal was still at liberty. She was certain of it. And with the authorities congratulating themselves, there was every chance they would strike again. This time, perhaps, with no Queen of Hearts to warn of the danger. The village was enjoying the pleasant illusion of resolution. With Gerald Lucas behind bars, the talk at the tea shop had turned to gardening and summer fetes, as though Jonathan Price's death had been nothing more than an untidy chapter now neatly closed. But Miss Marple, in her quiet way, kept watching. It was during one such quiet morning that the overlooked detail emerged, not from the present case, but from a memory. She had been sorting through old parish newsletters at the vicarage, looking for a program from a garden show, when she came across an article nearly 15 years old. It was a brief, rather unremarkable notice, the engagement of Jonathan Price to a Miss Eleanor Whitcomb. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the name. Eleanor Whitcomb, an older sister to the current Mrs. Whitcomb. The engagement had been broken, according to later gossip. under somewhat mysterious circumstances. Eleanor had left England shortly afterward, marrying abroad and passing away some years later. The incident had been politely forgotten, but Miss Marple's mind began fitting pieces together. Jonathan Price had once been tied to the Whitcomb family in more than passing acquaintance. A broken engagement could create long memories and long grudges. That afternoon, she visited Mr. Soames again. The postmaster was more forthcoming when pressed about the old days. "Oh, yes," he said, polishing his spectacles. "Price and Eleanor were quite the talk of the village once. Her younger sister, Margaret, was always around back then, very devoted to Eleanor." He paused, glancing at Miss Marple. "Some said she never forgave him for the way things ended. But time softened such things, I suppose." Miss Marple doubted it. Time didn't soften old wounds for everyone. It simply covered them over until they could be used. She walked from the post office directly to Mrs. Whitcomb's home. The widow welcomed her in with the same warm civility, but Miss Marple noticed how the decanter from Price's study had now been put away, replaced by a new arrangement of flowers. The tidy room was much as before, yet Miss Marple's eye caught a small framed photograph on the mantelpiece. Two young women, one unmistakably Mrs. Whitcomb, the other bearing the same features but with a softer smile. "Eleanor." Miss Marple commented on the picture lightly. Mrs. Whitcomb's response was measured, her voice too carefully even as she said, "My sister was a gentle soul. She deserved better than what she got from Jonathan Price." There it was, a thread from the past, stretching neatly into the present. Leaving the house, Miss Marple encountered Thomas, the servant, at the gate. He hesitated before speaking, his usual deference tinged with something heavier. "Begging your pardon, Miss Marple," he said, "but there's something I ought to tell you. Years ago, before I came into service here, Mr. Price and Mr. Lucas, they'd had dealings before. Abroad, I think. Something to do with land or investments. Mr. Price never spoke of it much, but whenever Lucas's name came up, he'd change the subject sharp-like. It was another connection, one that reached back further than anyone had been willing to admit. Lucas had not simply appeared in the village by chance, and Mrs. Whitcomb's loathing for Price was not born of financial inconvenience alone. Back at the vicarage, Miss Marple began sketching the relationships on paper. Price connected to Eleanor Whitcomb, Eleanor to her sister Margaret, Margaret to Lucas in a friendship or partnership that might not have been entirely innocent. Lucas to Price again through past financial dealings. Each line doubled back on another, forming not a straight chain of events, but a circle, one that had been in motion long before Price's death. And then there was the letter Price had sent to his solicitor, which never arrived. Miss Marple suspected that whatever it contained might have been the final link, tying the past and present into one. If someone had intercepted it, it was because its contents were too dangerous to see daylight. The past was not gone. It was the foundation of everything happening now. The murder had been less about one night's opportunity and more about a reckoning that had been building for years. Lucas, in custody, was part of the story, but not the conclusion. The true danger remained at large, and now Miss Marple could feel the shadow of it moving closer. Miss Marple had never been one for direct confrontation. She preferred the sort of tactic that seemed harmless, even whimsical, yet revealed truths no interrogation could force. The past had given her a strong suspicion of where the truth lay, but suspicion was not proof. Proof required patience and the right bait. The Queen of Hearts had been a curious thing, left as though meant to taunt. Miss Marple knew that people who commit such acts often cannot resist revisiting them, whether through pride or fear that their brilliance has been overlooked. It occurred to her that if the card had been a symbol, its meaning might draw the culprit out, if only she could suggest she had deciphered it. At the vicarage tea a few days later, Miss Marple contrived to gather the principal figures of the affair: Mrs. Whitcomb, Inspector Palmer, Thomas the servant, and even Gerald Lucas on brief release for a formal interview. She had laid the table with care, each place marked by a playing card slipped under the cup. Hearts for most, but only one queen. It rested at Mrs. Whitcomb's setting, as if placed there by accident. Conversation began lightly. Weather, the fete, small village matters. But Miss Marple, in her seemingly distracted way, mentioned a curious fact. "I've always thought it interesting," she said, buttering a scone. "How the Queen of Hearts is the only queen in the deck without a smile. Rather symbolic in certain situations, wouldn't you say? It makes one think of loyalty, or perhaps betrayal." Mrs. Whitcomb's hand paused for the briefest moment as she lifted her cup. Her face remained composed, but the smallest tremor passed through her fingers. She glanced, not at Miss Marple, but at the card beneath her cup as though it were a snake. Lucas laughed softly, amused but unconcerned, and Palmer muttered about village eccentricities. Only Mrs. Whitcomb seemed ever so slightly unsettled. Miss Marple allowed the moment to pass as though nothing had happened. But later, as they moved to the garden for tea cakes, she arranged for a small experiment. She had placed the decanter stopper from Price's house, retrieved discreetly from evidence, on a side table beside the refreshment tray. As guests helped themselves, Lucas poured wine without a glance at it. Thomas avoided the table altogether, staying by the edge of the group. But when Mrs. Whitcomb reached for a cake, her eyes flickered to the stopper with unmistakable recognition. Her hand faltered. She adjusted a flower vase that needed no adjusting, as though distracting herself. Miss Marple noted the reaction with quiet satisfaction. It was not proof in the legal sense, but it confirmed her theory. That evening she shared her thoughts with Palmer, though the inspector was reluctant. "You can't arrest someone for looking at a bit of glass," he said. "No," Miss Marple agreed, "but sometimes one doesn't need to arrest them at once. One simply needs to press the right nerve and see what happens. The guilty mind does the rest." The next morning, Miss Marple set her plan in motion. She asked Palmer to casually mention to Mrs. Whitcomb that the missing letter from Jonathan Price had been partially recovered. Its contents not yet public, but sure to be revealed at the inquest. It was a small deception, but one designed to test her reaction. By afternoon, word reached the vicarage that Mrs. Whitcomb had been seen at the solicitor's office, pale and anxious, inquiring whether the letter truly existed. The solicitor, of course, knew nothing of it. Miss Marple sat by her window that evening, her knitting steady. The web was tightening, the unconventional clues, the card at tea, the stopper, the false letter, had all touched a nerve. The mask was slipping. The next morning brought a jolt that rippled through the village. Inspector Palmer arrived at the vicarage looking more flustered than Miss Marple had ever seen him. "It's gone," he said without preamble, removing his hat with a rough motion. "The stopper from Price's decanter. Vanished from the evidence room sometime last night." Miss Marple, who was arranging dahlias in a vase, paused only a fraction before placing another stem. "That is very interesting," she murmured. "It's more than interesting. It's a blasted mess," Palmer said. "The constable swears the evidence room was locked. No sign of forced entry. Whoever took it knew what they were after. And I don't like that it happened just when you were starting to make something of it." Miss Marple's mind ticked quietly over the facts. The stopper was small, easy to conceal, worthless to anyone except the person it endangered. Its disappearance meant one thing: the truth was drawing too close, and someone had grown afraid. By midday, there was more bad news. The Queen of Hearts card, which had been carefully stored in a sealed envelope, was discovered missing as well. Palmer's temper boiled over. "Either I've got a thief under my nose, or someone's tampered with the evidence from outside," he muttered. Miss Marple didn't contradict him, but her thoughts ran deeper. The destruction of the two items most closely tied to Mrs. Whitcomb was no coincidence, but if the widow had managed to reach into the police evidence room, or had helped to do so, then someone close to Palmer's own team might be compromised. That evening she walked past Mrs. Whitcomb's house. The curtains were drawn, the light inside low, but she saw a shadow cross the window, too restless, too purposeful for a grieving widow. She decided to test a theory. The next morning she paid a visit under the pretext of returning a borrowed shawl. Over tea, she mentioned in her mildest tone, "Such a shame about the missing evidence. But I suppose in matters like this, the truth has a way of emerging, whether one hides a stopper or a playing card." Mrs. Whitcomb's smile was cool. "I don't follow your meaning, Miss Marple." "Of course not, my dear. Only I do wonder, what sort of person risks so much to erase such little things, unless they are not little at all?" For the first time, the widow's poise cracked just slightly. Her fingers tightened around her teacup. Her eyes narrowed. It was the reaction of someone not only aware of the theft, but fearful of its implications. Later that day, Palmer confirmed Miss Marple's suspicion of interference. The constable in charge of the evidence room, a young man named Reeve, had been found absent from his post for nearly half an hour the night before. He insisted he'd been called away by a message that later proved to be false. Someone had drawn him out, leaving the room vulnerable. The theft had escalated the stakes. Whoever was behind the murder was not merely trying to avoid suspicion. They were actively dismantling the path to the truth. Miss Marple returned to the vicarage that evening with her knitting, but her mind was far from her needles. The real killer was no longer content to let Lucas take the fall quietly. The destruction of evidence meant desperation, and desperation could lead to mistakes. The village awoke 2 mornings later to a sharper chill than the summer air could account for. News spread fast. Gerald Lucas, awaiting trial in the county jail, had been found dead in his cell. Inspector Palmer rode straight from the station to the vicarage, his face drawn and hard. "They're saying suicide," he told Miss Marple, his voice low. "But I don't buy it. No note. No sign of struggle. But Lucas was no man to take his own life. Not when he still thought he could talk his way free." Miss Marple set her knitting aside with deliberate care. "Suicide is a very convenient conclusion for certain people, Inspector. It saves them the bother of a trial that might dredge up uncomfortable truths." Palmer nodded grimly. "That's what I'm afraid of. If Lucas was silenced, it means our murderer is still moving freely, and bold enough to strike even under guard." The news rattled the village, but Miss Marple noticed that in some quarters it was greeted with too much composure. Mrs. Whitcomb expressed the appropriate regret when she heard, but her expression seemed lighter, as if an obstacle had been quietly removed from her path. The next evening the case took a sharper turn still. Miss Marple was walking home from the vicarage hall after a committee meeting when she sensed another presence on the lane behind her. The village was quiet at night. Too quiet. She adjusted her pace, then turned suddenly at a bend in the hedgerow. The lane was empty, but the faint rustle of movement came from the field beyond. When she arrived at her cottage, she found her parlor door slightly ajar. Inside, nothing was taken, but her papers, her neat notes on the price case, had been disturbed. One page was missing, her diagram of connections between the suspects. Whoever had entered hadn't come for valuables. They'd come for knowledge. Palmer was incensed when she told him. "First Lucas, now this. Someone's ahead of us at every turn. They must have someone watching your movements." Miss Marple only smiled faintly. "Then we must let them keep watching, Inspector, until they grow careless." The stakes had risen. Lucas's death had silenced one possible voice, and the break-in had confirmed another truth. The murderer was still active and willing to remove anyone who threatened their security. Miss Marple knew that the next move would not be hers alone. If she did not solve the case swiftly, there would be another victim. Miss Marple sat in her garden the following afternoon, her knitting idle in her lap, though her hands moved from habit. Palmer had gone off to verify alibis again, frustrated by the lack of progress, while the village simmered with fear. Yet for Miss Marple, the confusion was beginning to settle, not into certainty, but into a pattern. It was a remark from Mrs. Price, the late Jonathan Price's elderly sister, that had stayed in her mind. The old woman had been reminiscing about the evening of her brother's death when she said, in her vague way, of course, she always insisted on her own wine-glass, never trusted anyone else's. At the time, it had seemed a trivial eccentricity, the sort of thing wealthy women often affect. But the she in question had been Mrs. Whitcomb. Miss Marple thought back to the dinner party. Everyone had claimed they drank from the same decanter, yet if Mrs. Whitcomb had brought her own glass, or switched it at the table, it could explain how she had avoided the poisoned port entirely. That quirk of habit, unnoticed by all but Price's sharp-eyed sister, was a piece of the puzzle. Then there was the Queen of Hearts. Most saw it as a taunt, but Miss Marple now saw it differently. It was not a signature left in arrogance. It was a distraction, deliberately melodramatic to shift suspicion away from a subtle, practical act. And the stolen stopper, the missing card, they weren't just about destroying evidence. They were about removing the two items that, in Mrs. Whitcomb's mind, tied her too closely to the scene. It was all of a piece, careful planning wrapped in the appearance of happenstance. She reviewed the sequence again, the poisoned wine, the stolen evidence, Lucas's death, the break-in at her own home. They were all defensive acts, aimed not at securing a conviction, but at keeping one woman clear of suspicion. Miss Marple rose, set her knitting neatly aside, and went to her desk. She took out a fresh sheet of paper and began listing every movement Mrs. Whitcomb had made the night of the murder, every alibi and explanation. With each line, the pattern became clearer. When Palmer returned at dusk, she was ready. "Inspector," she said, "you've been looking for a clever murderer. But you've been expecting her cleverness to be in the killing itself. In truth, her cleverness lies in the misdirection afterwards. The real trick was done in plain sight, in the moment everyone thought nothing unusual had happened." Palmer frowned. "And you're certain you can prove it?" Miss Marple gave him her faintest smile. "With a little help, yes. All we need now is to encourage her to make one last move." Miss Marple's snare began with a whisper, not a confrontation. She knew Mrs. Whitcomb well enough to understand that an outright accusation would only drive her deeper into defense. What was needed was pressure, a suggestion that her carefully built facade was beginning to crack. That pressure came from a casual remark delivered by the vicar's wife at the next parish gathering. It had been arranged, of course, at Miss Marple's prompting. "Such a dreadful business, but I hear Jonathan Price's will is to be contested. I suppose that will make things rather awkward for those who expected to benefit." The remark had its intended effect. Mrs. Whitcomb froze mid-pour of tea, the silver pot trembling just slightly before she recovered herself. Miss Marple, seated at the far end of the table, saw it all. What most in the village didn't know, and what Miss Marple had discovered through a quiet inquiry at the solicitor's office, was that Price's will named Mrs. Whitcomb as sole beneficiary to an old investment trust he had been managing. But the trust itself was unusual. It wasn't a large sum, certainly not enough to kill for on its own. But in the back pages of the trust's documents lay a revelation that changed everything. Jonathan Price had been holding the trust not for his own gain, but as the silent custodian of funds left for the daughter of a woman long dead, Clara Whitcomb. A scandal from decades past had driven Clara to a quiet life abroad, leaving her child in the care of a distant relation who never publicly acknowledged her. That child was now Mrs. Whitcomb. Miss Marple had pieced it together from fragments, old parish records, a faded photograph in the vicarage archives, and the subtle way Price had always treated the widow with a peculiar mixture of distance and responsibility. Mrs. Whitcomb was not simply a beneficiary. She was the hidden heir to a scandal Jonathan Price had quietly protected all these years. But the trust, if revealed, would also expose her origins, something she had worked her entire adult life to keep buried. The motive, then, was not greed alone. It was fear. Fear that Price, for reasons of his own, was about to bring the truth to light. When Palmer heard this, his brows drew together. "So you're saying she killed him to stop him from telling the truth about her family?" Miss Marple nodded. "Appearances are the currency in which she has lived, Inspector. A carefully built life as the respectable widow of the parish, to have that swept away, to be revealed as the illegitimate child of a scandal, that is the one thing she could not endure. And so she acted to preserve her standing. Money was merely the means. Reputation was the end." The revelation altered the shape of the case entirely. The crime had been far more personal than the police had guessed. Mrs. Whitcomb had not killed out of cold calculation alone, but from a desperation rooted in a lifetime of concealment. Miss Marple knew that this, more than any piece of physical evidence, was the lever that could unseat her, and so she planned to use it carefully, for a cornered woman was at her most dangerous. It was a Wednesday afternoon when Miss Marple suggested to Inspector Palmer that a small gathering be held at the vicarage to discuss the village's anxieties. In truth, it was no ordinary meeting. It was a stage, and she had cast her audience carefully. Mrs. Whitcomb was invited, along with the Price's solicitor, Mrs. Price's sister, and a few parish stalwarts who could not resist a whiff of drama disguised as propriety. Palmer looked skeptical when Miss Marple explained her plan. "You're going to corner her in front of half the parish?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "No, Inspector. I'm going to let her corner herself." The meeting began innocently, with tea poured and sympathetic murmurs about the troubles that had beset the village. Mrs. Whitcomb sat poised as always, her hat at the perfect angle, her hands steady as porcelain. Miss Marple let the talk circle aimlessly before she spoke, her voice soft and deliberate. "It's a curious thing about trust funds," she said, "how they can carry the past into the present. I was reminded of dear Clara Whitcomb just the other day. Such a pretty girl in her time, though her story was a sad one." There was the smallest pause in the room. Mrs. Whitcomb's teacup halted halfway to her lips. Miss Marple went on, her knitting needles clicking in unhurried rhythm. "Jonathan Price was a kind man to take such trouble over her affairs, though I imagine he must have known it was only a matter of time before the details came to light. Such things do have a way of surfacing, you know." Mrs. Whitcomb's face had grown pale, though her expression remained fixed. "I'm afraid I don't see the relevance, Miss Marple," she said, her voice tight. "No?" Miss Marple looked up, her expression mild. "It seems to me most relevant, especially when one considers the extraordinary lengths to which someone has gone to prevent certain truths from being spoken. Poison in a decanter, a playing card as a theatrical flourish, a suicide that was no suicide at all. It rather suggests a mind both resourceful and desperate." A faint murmur rippled through the room. The solicitor shifted uncomfortably. Palmer watched in silence, his gaze fixed on Mrs. Whitcomb. The widow set down her teacup with a sharp clink. "This is absurd. You are insinuating—" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "that all these acts form a pattern pointing to someone who feared disgrace more than the gallows, someone who would protect her standing at any cost. Someone who could not bear for the truth of her birth to become common knowledge." For a moment, the room held its breath. Mrs. Whitcomb's eyes flashed. Anger, fear, calculation, all at once. She rose abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "You have no proof. she said, but her voice shook now. Miss Marple's gaze was calm, almost pitying. "My dear, the proof is in every step you took to hide what you most feared. The missing evidence, the silenced witness, even the break-in at my own home. You have been writing your confession in actions for weeks. It only needed reading." For a long moment, Mrs. Whitcomb stood frozen. Then, as though something in her composure finally fractured, she turned sharply toward the door. Palmer was there first, blocking her path. Her defiance faltered, and she sank back into her chair, her gloved hands trembling. "I didn't mean for it to happen that way," she said at last, her voice low, strained. But he wouldn't stop. He was going to tell. Everything I had built, everything I was, it would all have been ruined. The room was utterly still. Palmer stepped forward, his voice firm but measured. "Mary Whitcomb, I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of Jonathan Price." Miss Marple quietly gathered her knitting. She had no satisfaction in the moment, only a deep, weary understanding of what pride and fear could drive a person to do. The village had already begun to settle back into its quiet rhythms by the following week. Mrs. Whitcomb had been taken to London, the newspapers had had their fill of scandal, and Inspector Palmer had returned to more routine work. Miss Marple sat at her window, looking out over the churchyard, thinking the matter quite finished, until the solicitor came calling. Mr. Radcliffe was a cautious man, not prone to drama, but there was a stiffness in his manner as he accepted Miss Marple's offer of tea. "It concerns the Whitcomb Trust," he began, clearing his throat. "In reviewing the documents, we found irregularities. It seems Jonathan Price had altered the beneficiary terms shortly before his death. Mrs. Whitcomb was not, in fact, to inherit the full sum. A substantial portion was redirected to another party entirely." Miss Marple set her teacup down, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Another party?" Radcliffe nodded gravely. "To Mr. Lionel Faraday." The name fell like a stone into a still pond. Faraday, the ever-charming neighbor, so full of sympathy after the murder, so willing to defend Mrs. Whitcomb's character. And yet he had always hovered on the edges, never quite in the frame, but never far from it either. Miss Marple's mind began to move swiftly, sifting through conversations. Faraday's insistence on Mrs. Whitcomb's delicate nerves, his eagerness to supply Palmer with helpful suggestions that subtly pointed suspicion away from her. His presence at the vicarage that night, when Mrs. Whitcomb's composure cracked. Palmer had been convinced the case was closed, but Miss Marple now saw that Faraday had benefited from every stage of the affair. Whether Mrs. Whitcomb hanged or went free, his name never appeared in the dock, but his pockets would be considerably heavier, thanks to a will few knew had been altered. That night, Miss Marple walked to Faraday's cottage under the guise of returning a borrowed gardening book. His smile was warm, but she noticed the faint tension in his jaw. As they spoke, she let drop the news of the trust alteration as though it were idle gossip. For just a heartbeat, his eyes sharpened, too quick, too revealing. "Curious, isn't it?" Miss Marple said mildly. "How Jonathan Price chose to leave such a legacy to a man he had only known a few years. Almost as though you had some hold over him." Faraday's smile didn't falter, but his voice had a brittle edge. "You think I—" "Oh, I don't think," Miss Marple said gently. "I observe. And I observed that Jonathan Price was a careful man. He did nothing without reason. A reason I suspect that lies in something he knew about you, something worth paying to keep quiet." Faraday's fingers tightened imperceptibly on his glass. "You have quite the imagination, Miss Marple." "Not imagination, Mr. Faraday," she replied, her eyes calm but piercing. "Memory. I remember how very insistent you were that Mrs. Whitcomb attend the dinner party that night, despite her reluctance. I remember your discreet visits to her house in the weeks before, under the guise of advice. And I rather think that without your subtle encouragement, she might never have taken such a desperate step at all." For a moment, the air between them was still, taut. Then Faraday's smile returned, smoother than ever, though it no longer reached his eyes. "You can't prove anything, Miss Marple," he said softly. Miss Marple inclined her head. "Perhaps not in court, but the thing about secrets, Mr. Faraday, is that they have a way of slipping out, just as Jonathan Price's nearly did." Faraday's expression hardened, but she rose, giving him no further satisfaction. She had no intention of pressing Palmer for another arrest, not yet. The law might not have the evidence, but Miss Marple knew the truth. And so did Faraday. As she walked back through the quiet lane, she reflected that justice was not always a neat affair. Sometimes it lingered, like a shadow at the edge of a sunny village. But sooner or later, shadows moved. The winter sun lay pale over St. Mary Mead when Inspector Palmer returned, his expression a mixture of irritation and reluctant respect. He had just come from London, where Mrs. Whitcomb, after several days of legal wrangling, had formally confessed. But Palmer was here for another reason, and it wasn't the signed statement in his pocket. "It's Faraday, isn't it?" he said without preamble as Miss Marple ushered him in. She didn't answer immediately, merely poured his tea with her usual care. "I wondered how long it would take you," she said at last. "Yes, Mr. Faraday played his part very well. So well, in fact, that most of the village will go on thinking of him as an unlucky gentleman friend who found himself attached to a doomed woman." Palmer frowned. "And yet you believe he, what? Pushed her toward it?" "Encouraged her despair," Miss Marple said gently. "Fed her fear of disgrace, of the trust being examined, of the whispers that might follow. Mrs. Whitcomb already had the motive. What Mr. Faraday supplied was opportunity and a nudge at just the right moment." Palmer leaned forward. "Do you have proof?" Miss Marple shook her head. "Proof, no. But consider this, the altered will, naming him as beneficiary to a portion of the trust. His alibi the night of the murder is paper thin. He was hosting that bridge game, but conveniently excused himself for nearly half an hour. And then there are the little things, his knowledge of the decanter's vintage, his insistence that Mrs. Whitcomb attend the dinner at all. Not enough for the law, perhaps, but quite enough for me." Palmer grunted, frustration in his tone. "So he walks free." "For now," Miss Marple said, her voice steady. "Men like Mr. Faraday do, but he will find another opportunity, another little scheme, and when he does, the law will have cause enough. One cannot live so near the line without tripping over it in the end." Weeks later, Faraday was gone. The cottage stood empty, shutters drawn, a hastily scrawled note sent to the solicitor explaining he had business abroad. The village, with its short memory for scandal, let the matter drift into the background. Mrs. Whitcomb's trial concluded with her sentence, and her story became a cautionary whisper. But in the vicarage drawing-room, a small group gathered at Miss Marple's invitation. Palmer was there, as was the vicar's wife, Mrs. Price's sister, and a few others who had asked, half in curiosity, half in awe, how she had known. Miss Marple sat with her knitting, her voice calm as she recounted the chain of reasoning. It began with the playing card, of course. A flourish unnecessary to the act itself. That suggested another hand. Someone who wanted the death to appear dramatic, almost theatrical. Mrs. Whitcomb was desperate, but she was not flamboyant. That led me to suspect an influence. Then there was her uncharacteristic attendance at the dinner. Mrs. Whitcomb avoids crowds when distressed, yet Mr. Faraday coaxed her there. He had also been pressing her about the trust in private, something I learned from a certain overheard conversation in the churchyard. And lastly, the will. Jonathan Price was careful. He would never have altered it in Faraday's favor unless pressed or threatened. The connection was too neat to ignore. Palmer listened, jaw set. "And yet, all we have is your word, and the pattern you've seen." Miss Marple smiled faintly. Which, Inspector, is more than enough for me. I have seen many patterns in my time. Some are woven slowly, others unravel quickly. Mr. Faraday's will unravel in its own time. There was a quiet in the room as her words settled. Justice, after all, was not always swift, nor always delivered by the courts. As the guests departed and the room grew still, Miss Marple returned to her seat by the fire. Outside, St. Mary Mead looked as peaceful as ever, its little cottages trimmed and proper. But she knew the truth. Beneath the quiet surface, there were always shadows, and she would always be watching. The snow in St. Mary Mead had begun to melt, revealing the damp earth beneath when Miss Marple took her usual afternoon walk. The village was calm again. Postmen on their routes, shopkeepers sweeping doorsteps, but she knew peace was always a thin layer, never the whole story. On the corner by the post office, she paused to greet Mr. Symington, who was bundling letters. As he sorted, through a pile, one envelope slipped, landing face up on the pavement. A strange thing, a foreign stamp, faintly smudged, addressed not to anyone in the village but to Mr. Lionel Faraday. Miss Marple bent to hand it back, her eyes catching a detail. The handwriting was hurried but elegant, the ink just faded enough to suggest haste. Strange to see Mr. Faraday's name on post after he's left us, she remarked mildly. Symington looked puzzled. Left no forwarding address either. Been holding on to these, but London hasn't called for them. Miss Marple tucked the moment away. That evening she sat by her fire, turning over the thought like a pebble in her palm. Faraday was gone. Yes, but gone where? And why was someone writing to him from abroad? There was no proof of anything untoward, only the faint sense of a thread left dangling. She reached for her knitting, her mind wandering back to Jonathan Price's will, the timing of its amendment, and Faraday's perfectly timed disappearance. The solicitor had assumed it all explained by scandal, but Miss Marple wondered. Men like Faraday did not simply vanish. They moved with purpose. The next morning, she received a small package at her door. No note, no sender, just a slim box containing a playing card. The ace of spades. Her lips pursed. She examined it closely, noting the faint scent of cigar smoke on the cardboard, the kind that clung to the men's clubs in London. It was a message, whether a taunt or a warning, she could not yet tell. Later that week, Palmer visited to tie up paperwork from the Whitcomb case. She didn't mention the card, not yet. The inspector was already irritated enough over Faraday's absence, muttering about lost leads. As he prepared to leave, Palmer said, almost absently, "Funny thing, there was a case in Brighton, not unlike the Whitcomb affair.